Hi, everyone. This is Tori Vandelin with Prevent Connect. This is part 3 of a 4-part podcast with the authors of the study, Expanding the Frame, Institutional Responses to Students Accused of Sexual Misconduct. On this podcast, Jennifer Henkel, Joan Sabachnik, and Jill Dunlap provide an overview of a day-long training they hosted for higher education professionals implementing Respondent Services, and provide an insight into how these trainings connect the dots between institutional responses to sexual violence and preventing violence before it occurs.
One of the things that you all had brought up as recommendations that you included in the report was a need for specialized training for folks on campus who are providing respondent services. So I know that there was a comprehensive training on implementation of respondent services at the 2020 NASPA Strategies Conference. So, can you all tell me more about what was included in that training and what were some key takeaways from attendees at that training?
Sure. So I think first I want to start, and I know Jennifer mentioned this earlier, but by recognizing that there have been trainings that have happened before around respondent services and how to implement them, because this isn't we're not the first to do this work. There's back when I was at the University of California system and I served on the presidential task force for prevention and response to sexual violence, we were creating job descriptions for respondent services on each of the 10 UC campuses. So this has been going on, and that was back in 2015. So this has been going on for a while. What we were trying to do is create a training that was capturing a lot of what we learned from the survey and the interviews that we did as part of it leading up to the survey development, and throughout as we talked about hearing from our colleagues. And so this training was really focused on, okay, so here's what exists. If you're thinking about doing this, or if you have sort of very preliminary respondent services on your campus and you're trying to think through how to make them more comprehensive. And so it was really data driven in the way that we tried to say, there are different models. For example, some institutions we found have one full-time person. That's great. If they have a large caseload, that might not be as ideal, in the same way that you wouldn't want one survivor advocate on a campus, but at least you have an identifiable one full-time person. Other institutions are really taking a team approach where they are getting people up to speed and have a variety of sort of volunteers that are from among the faculty and staff members at an institution that have agreed to be a part of this and are serving in that capacity. And so a lot of that training was really sort of focused on, how is this related to the current policy climate? How can this help? How does respondent services help you maybe address the need to be more equitable in your processes? But also sort of understanding the idea of person-centered language, and that we're talking about people with problematic sexual behaviors, and that represents a range of people on our campuses. But then also thinking through, and I would say that, and again, I encourage Joan and Jennifer to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the majority of what we found that institutions are currently offering is centered on students who are currently involved in a sexual misconduct investigative process, so a Title IX investigation. And so we, as part of the training, encouraged the folks that were in attendance to really think through, okay, so how do you get at the students who have problematic sexual behaviors but haven't been accused, or who have been accused and been found not responsible, or students who have been found responsible, served a sanction, and are now coming back to your institution, up to and including students who are entering your institution who were not found responsible at your institution, but perhaps come in with a transcript notation from another institution. So really looking at the wide range of students for whom a respondent services could be supporting in their in their from coming from various needs. So we talked about the different types of support models that exist. We talked through, and again, we've covered a lot of this today, but the sort of specific duties that a respondent support person might have, including thinking around safety planning and how to encourage them to avoid having contact with the responding party, and thinking through retaliation issues. We talked about where those response or respondent support services might best fit. We talk about what happens if when you're using the argument that you're trying to make your processes more equitable for both responding parties and reporting parties. what are you saying if you have a survivor advocate who is very low on the hierarchical ladder of an institution, and yet respondent support services are coming out of the dean of students office, right? So thinking through what that looks like in terms of where these support services are found, and then also like how are institutions notifying students that these respondent support services exist when they do? Because again, what we know about, if you have support services for survivors on a campus and you don't tell anybody that they exist, you're going to have a lower rate of reporting than if you know, robustly sort of communicate to students that, hey, if this should happen to you, you have someone to whom you can turn. And so that, I think, is another key takeaway from what we were trying to get across with the participants in that training. And again, there are a variety of different groups that do really robust training around other sort of more specific areas around respondent services, like risk assessment models, and you know, what are best practices for sanctioning models and that sort of thing. But this was really sort of a more holistic look at, if you're not currently doing this, here's some places that you could start, and here are some ways that you can document that other institutions are also doing this similarly. Because I would say that, you know, coming from working at 3 different campuses, if you can say to somebody, well, I know they're doing it here in this way, right? If you can point to another institution that's doing it in a certain way to justify why you want to do something, you're more likely to you know, be able to make some traction there, rather than we just think this is the best thing. And so I think that was also a goal of ours, is to say, okay, so here's some data to back up what it is that, you know we should be doing, if you're having some trouble making that argument at your institution. And if you already have these services, how do you strengthen and expand the range of students for whom you're providing those services? So that was really, I think, the focus of that 8 hours. It's a lot, right? Like we've covered so much even in this conversation, and so to
Mhm.
think that you can set up an institution to do this really well in 8 hours, you know, that wasn't our goal. It wasn't sort of a, you're certified to do anything. It was more of a consideration of, how do you do this if you're starting out, and how do you do it better if you already have something in place?
Mhm.
And we did a follow-up survey and got some really good feedback, and some people who want to talk to us about, if we do this again, how can we do it a little differently? But I know just from that feedback that campuses really appreciated. One, they said it was worthwhile. It was worth, the pre-con did cost additional funds. But the connection to other individuals doing this work, because it does feel so isolating, as well as that, like Jill was talking about, that piece of how do I bring this to my campus and kind of convince upper level administration that this is something we should be doing, not just because anecdotally I think it's the right thing to do, or because other campuses are necessarily doing it, but giving them that data and also giving them some of the language for how can this reduce liability on your campus? Because sometimes that is the bottom line, and that is what's most important for a particular decision maker on campus, and that's fine. But how do we help campuses expand these services and do what's best for everyone involved in these types of cases?
I think also for me that one of the things I loved later in the conference, I was speaking with someone who had attended our workshop and said that our full day had really expanded the frame for him in a really significant way of how he looks at services. And that when so often that I think that people sometimes come into this work and don't have this full range. And I think that one of the things I really appreciate about working with Jill and Jennifer is that sort of realizing that we often have silos of
Mhm.
information that,
Mhm.
and I think that part of the training did for me, like a lot of us sort of break apart some of the silos. I feel like in all of our conversations, even in preparing for it, I feel like there was many moments where Jill or Jennifer would say something and I'd be like, oh wow, I hadn't thought of it in that way. And I think the same thing I hope is true the other way around, is when I was bringing and sharing some of the information and research that I bring to the table. So that's, I think, part of it, I think, to me, was one of the, and maybe it's maybe the thing's to say it's magical, but when I think one of those really like when moments about what I think it makes a really great training is when even the trainers between us are having these aha moments about
Mhm.
sharing and expanding new things. And I think, at least from the audience, I think that, at least given the work that I was presenting, I think that this idea that not all the students who they're going to be working with are the same, that they're coming with very different experiences, as well as very different behaviors, very different motivations, different developmental stages, different cognitive stages. And I think that when we started pulling that apart, it seemed like that was a big sort of takeaway or aha moment, I think, for some of the attendees as well.
I
Well,
think
I would just add to that, like I agree with you, Joan. I think it was magical whenever the three of us are together. But I think one of the other things that I really learned from Joan's perspective, and again, like I come from a victim advocate perspective. Jennifer comes from case management, who in a lot of ways she said is the sort of natural home for a lot of respondent services. And then Joan, with her background, the way that we all come together, I think, has made what we're able to provide in terms of information really unique. But I would say that the other thing that really triggers in my mind that is valuable whenever we're all together is when Joan is able to point to community resources. And again, it's sort of the idea that we have to really start to think more broadly about what we're doing with this set of respondent students who are on our campus, and that institutions are becoming more aware, if they aren't already, right, in the past few years, about the range of community resources that exist for survivors, and forming MOUs with local rape crisis centers and local domestic violence shelters. And there, I think, isn't as robust a community of support providers. There are some, and that has been a really great thing that Joan has brought to the table. But I think institutions haven't yet thought, oh, I can also look to the community for these resources for my respondent students in the same way that I do when I need, additional support and expertise from people who have been doing this work for decades in the community. I think it's easier to identify the local rape crisis center or the local domestic violence shelter, but that they haven't sort of crossed that bridge around, I can do the same thing in terms of providing additional community support or relying on community expertise to provide services for respondents. And so for me, that's been a point that Joan brings up consistently in our presentations on this topic is, that you should be able to look at some of these places so that you can, provide similar expertise to, this other population of students.
I think something else I'll add, I know I've already spoken, so sorry, but that came out of this and that really helped me in moving forward and talking to campuses about this is also the piece of utilization. I mean, I've seen some feedback online about this survey already, and the key area that I think people are seeing and that is out of context is the utilization of services. So there's inequity in how campuses are offering these services in terms of whether there's a full-time employee or how many full-time employees there are providing these services, if they have those types of resources. Ultimately, we're seeing that very few responding parties are taking advantage of these services. And what our attendees at this training were talking about was how difficult it's been for them to really convince students to buy into respondent services, a lot of times due to legal counsel and their misunderstanding of what respondent services means and whether or not they're allowed to utilize both. Like, can they have legal counsel as well as this person on campus who just literally is there to explain their campus rights or explain the policy and explain what the investigation process might look like? And what some campuses were talking about doing that I thought was really cool is advocating in their community with legal counsel and really educating their area lawyers on respondent services in order to increase the number of responding parties who actually take advantage of services on campus. And I think if we can increase the utilization of services, that this is absolutely something that equitability wise we'll see more FTEs on campuses as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's a really great point about how campuses balance what they can provide versus what exists in the community versus what doesn't exist in the community. And they need to find a way to train and dedicate time and staff for.
Thanks for listening. Tune in to part 4, the final installment of this podcast, where guests discuss how restorative justice, respondent services, and primary prevention work together to create campus environments free from sexual violence.